On October 30th, 2015, hundreds of young people packed into Colectiv Club in Bucharest for a concert by metalcore band Goodbye to Gravity. Nobody knew this night would change Romania forever, exposing deep problems in the system and causing one of the biggest social movements since the fall of communism. Colectiv was housed in an old industrial building in Sector 4 of Bucharest. Since opening in 2013, it had become a popular spot for alternative music fans. That night, between 350 and 400 people squeezed in to hear Goodbye to Gravity play songs from their new album, Mantras of War. The mood was electric. The crowd, mostly people in their 20s and 30s, filled every corner of the space. Some leaned against pillars while others pushed close to the stage. The band members, Andrei Galutz, vocals, Mihai Alexandru and Vlad Selea, guitars, Alex Pascu, bass, and Bogdan Enache, drums, were ready for their big moment. The show started at around 9 p.m. Many fans held up their phones to record the performance. As part of the show, the band used fireworks to make it more exciting. Nobody realized these would be very dangerous in a room full of flammable materials. At about 10:30 p.m. during the song The Day We Die, which would later sound horribly ironic, the fireworks ignited the soundproofing foam on one of the club's pillars. This foam, not treated with fire-resistant chemicals, caught fire amazingly fast. At first, many thought the flames were part of the show, but singer Andrei shouted into the mic, "This is not part of the show. Please find an extinguisher." In just 30 seconds, the flames reached the ceiling. Within 60 seconds, the whole club was filled with thick, toxic smoke. The foam didn't just burn. It released cyanide and other deadly gases into the closed space. Panic took over instantly. Everyone rushed toward the only working exit, a double door with just one side open, creating a deadly bottleneck. People were trampled in the desperate rush to escape. Others, lost in the thick smoke and sudden darkness after the fire hit the electrical system, couldn't find the way out. Witnesses remember the screams for help, bodies falling on top of each other, the sharp smell of toxic smoke, and unbearable heat. Photos show young people with blackened faces, some crawling on the floor to get out, others helping injured friends. Those who escaped first came back to help those still trapped, forming human chains to pull people from the burning club. The first emergency calls came in at 10:32 p.m. Ambulances and firefighters arrived about 10 minutes later, but for many, those minutes were fatal. The intense heat and toxic smoke caused severe burns and poisoned those trapped inside. When emergency teams arrived, they found a nightmare. Dozens of unconscious young people both inside and in front of the club, some with terrible burns, others suffering from smoke inhalation. Victims were rushed to Bucharest hospitals, mainly to Floreasca Emergency Hospital, the Burns Hospital, and the Military Emergency Hospital. Emergency services were quickly overwhelmed. The sheer number of severely burned victims far exceeded what specialized units could handle. In the first hours after the fire, 27 people died, and over 180 were hospitalized in critical condition. But the tragedy didn't end there. In the days and weeks that followed, the death toll kept rising as more victims died from their injuries. Many suffered extensive burns, sometimes covering over 70% of their bodies, along with damaged airways from breathing the toxic smoke. Romanian doctors, facing the biggest medical disaster in recent memory, worked around the clock to save lives. But the limited resources and poor medical infrastructure became painfully clear. News about the tragedy spread quickly through social media and TV. In the hours after the fire, desperate relatives searched for information about loved ones. Photos and messages about missing people flooded online platforms, along with calls for blood donors. Romanians responded in huge numbers, forming long lines at the blood bank centers across the country. The morning after the tragedy, the awful reality became clearer. Images from inside the burned club shocked the entire nation. Questions started coming up. How could a club without fire safety permits operate in the capital city? Why weren't there proper emergency exits? Who allowed flammable materials to be used for soundproofing? Where were the fire extinguishers and sprinkler systems? The initial investigation showed serious negligence on multiple levels. Colectiv was operating without the required fire safety authorization. The ceiling and walls were covered with cheap, flammable soundproofing materials installed without mandatory fireproof treatment. The emergency exit was blocked, forcing over 300 people to use a single narrow door. There were no working fire extinguishers or sprinkler systems. But beyond these issues, Romanian society began to realize that the Colectiv tragedy was just the visible part of widespread corruption and administrative failure. Fake permits, meaningless inspections, bribes, and personal connections that allowed dangerous places to operate were all symptoms of much deeper problems. This awareness grew when information came out that the Emergency Situations Department in Bucharest knew about clubs operating without fire permits, including Colectiv, but did nothing. The Sector 4 City Hall, responsible for issuing business permits, was also accused of negligence and possible corruption. As the death toll rose, public anger intensified. 5 days after the tragedy, on November 3, 2015, about 25,000 people protested in Bucharest, with thousands more in other cities across Romania. They demanded the resignation of Sector 4 Mayor Cristian Popescu Piedone, Internal Affairs Minister Gabriel Oprea, and Prime Minister Victor Ponta. Carrying signs saying "corruption kills" and chanting "shame, shame on you," protesters demanded accountability and real changes in public administration. The protests worked. The next day, Prime Minister Victor Ponta announced his government's resignation, saying, "I have the moral obligation to take this step." Mayor Piedone also stepped down that same day. For the first time since the fall of communism, peaceful protests had brought down a Romanian government. Meanwhile, the medical situation remained critical. Romania's healthcare system, underfunded and poorly equipped to handle such a disaster, was overwhelmed. Reports about the poor conditions in burn units, lack of essential medications and equipment, and the lack of transparency made the public even angrier. International help became crucial. Countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Germany, Austria, Israel, and the UK offered assistance, taking in severely burned patients at their specialized hospitals. In total, 50 patients were transferred abroad in the first weeks after the fire, a silent admission that the Romanian medical system couldn't cope. But the transfers weren't enough to save everyone. Infections acquired in hospitals became a deadly threat to many injured people who stayed in Romania. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria, common in many Romanian hospitals, made treatment much harder for burn victims whose immune systems were already weak. This aspect of the tragedy was later shown in the documentary film Colectiv, which revealed how corruption in the medical system added to the rising death toll. 2 weeks after the fire, Dr. Camelia Roiu from the Burns Hospital in Bucharest reignited public outrage when she revealed that hospital disinfectants were being diluted, making them practically useless against bacteria. This led to a major investigation that uncovered a corruption network in medical supplies, centered around the Hexi Pharma Company, which had been selling diluted disinfectants to hospitals across Romania. Meanwhile, the investigation into the direct causes of the fire moved forward. On November 6, 2015, the 3 Colectiv club owners, Alin George Anastasescu, Paul Gansea, and Costin Mincu, were arrested on charges of manslaughter, causing bodily harm, and failing to follow legal safety measures. 2 pyrotechnicians from the company that provided the fireworks were also detained. The investigation soon extended to public officials. Former Mayor Cristian Popescu Piedoni was arrested on November 6, 2015, accused of signing Colective's operating permit while knowing it didn't meet legal requirements. 3 City Hall officials were also detained. Later, officials from the Emergency Inspectorate were investigated for knowing about the club's problems but doing nothing. As time passed, the death toll continued to rise. By the end of 2015, 63 people had died. A 64th victim, a 19-year-old woman being treated in France, died in October 2016, almost a year after the fire. Each new death brought the tragedy back into public view and extended the national mourning. Those who survived with severe burns faced an incredibly difficult recovery. Multiple surgeries, skin grafts, pain management, physical therapy, and deep psychological trauma became their daily reality. Many were left with permanent scars, both physical and emotional, horrifying reminders of a night that changed their lives forever. I've had over 15 surgeries so far. I can't count how many skin grafts I've had, said one survivor a year after the tragedy. But what hurts most are the memories. I still hear the screams. I still smell the burning flesh. My friends burning, everyone else burning. I lost 2 friends that night. Why did I survive and they didn't? This question haunts me every day. The families of those who died were also marked for life by unimaginable loss. Parents who buried their children, siblings left alone, partners who lost their significant other. For all of them, October 30th, 2015, began an endless nightmare. I lost the meaning of life that night, said the father of a 22-year-old woman who died 2 weeks after the fire. I live only to fight for justice. I want those responsible to pay. The Colectiv tragedy also created an unprecedented wave of solidarity in Romanian society. Massive blood donations, fundraising for burn victims, hospital volunteering, and free legal help for victims' families all showed a remarkable ability for people to come together. The tragedy also sparked a much broader civic movement aimed at changing Romanian society from the ground up. The slogan, "Corruption Kills," born in the days after the fire, became a rallying cry for those demanding deep reforms in public administration, healthcare, and justice. Groups like Colectiv GTG 3010 and the National Association of Burn Victims were formed to support victims' rights and push for new laws. The political impact was significant too. After Ponta's government resigned, President Klaus Iohannis appointed a technocrat government led by Dacian Cioloș, a former European commissioner. This government started reforms to improve transparency in public administration and strengthen emergency response capabilities. One of the new government's first actions was developing a plan for better burn treatment facilities. Money was set aside to upgrade existing units and build new specialized centers. Emergency response plans were revised, and there was more focus on improving communication between agencies during major emergencies. At the same time, new laws were passed to prevent fires and improve safety in public spaces. Fire safety permits became mandatory for all types of public buildings and businesses, and every public venue underwent thorough inspections. Clubs, theaters, cinemas, and other gathering places had to meet stricter safety standards. The diluted disinfectant scandal led to reforms in how medical supplies were purchased. The health ministry created new procedures for testing and verifying medical products, and the procurement process became more transparent. Problems with hospital infections were officially recognized, and measures to fight them were added to the national health strategy. Despite these improvements, the road to justice for Colectiv victims proved long and difficult. The trial of the club owners, pyrotechnicians, and public officials only began in 2016, and the complexity of the case meant proceedings dragged on much longer than expected. Victims' families complained about delays, changing judges, and various legal maneuvers, meant to postpone a verdict. The first verdict in the Colectiv case came from the Bucharest tribunal in December 2019, more than 4 years after the tragedy. The 3 club owners were sentenced to 11 years and 8 months in prison each, the pyrotechnicians to 12 years and 8 months each, and former Mayor Popescu Piedoni to 8 years and 6 months for abuse of office. Other City Hall officials and firefighters also received prison sentences. However, all parties appealed the verdict, and the trial continued at the Bucharest Court of Appeal. Survivors and victims' families harshly criticized how long the trial was taking, seeing it as another form of victimization. "We lost our children twice," said one victim's mother, "once in the fire and a second time in the courtroom, where we see justice dragging on year after year." While the legal process continued, the memory of the tragedy was kept alive through various civic and artistic efforts. Every year on October 30th, thousands gather in front of the former Colectiv Club to remember, bringing candles, flowers, and messages for those who died. Memorial concerts, art exhibits, books, and documentaries have helped keep their memory alive and spread the message that such a tragedy must never happen again. One of the most powerful projects was the documentary Colectiv, directed by Alexander Nanau and released in 2019. The film follows both survivors and the newspaper investigation into corruption in the healthcare system. It received international acclaim and was nominated for 2 Academy Awards in 2021, Best Documentary Feature and Best International Feature Film, the first Oscar nominations in Romanian cinema history. The documentary brought the Colectiv tragedy back into global attention, exposing deep systemic problems in post-communist Romania. It shows how journalists discovered that hospital disinfectants were diluted to just 10% of the necessary strength, and how this fraud was known and tolerated by authorities. It also documents the struggles within the health ministry and the political pressures that blocked real reform. 5 years after the tragedy, in October 2020, Romania faced a new crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, which again tested its fragile healthcare system. Many noticed disturbing similarities between how the Colectiv tragedy and the pandemic were handled. The same structural problems, lack of transparency, and tendency to deny reality despite clear evidence. Colectiv survivors, many still needing medical care, were especially vulnerable during the pandemic. With immune systems weakened by severe burns and long treatments, they were at high risk from the coronavirus. Many of their planned medical procedures were postponed because hospitals were overwhelmed. "It's like we're reliving Colectiv, but on a national scale," said one survivor in spring 2020. "The same lies, the same incompetence, the same empty promises. Nothing has really changed." Many Romanians shared this view. Despite promised reforms after Colectiv, they saw few fundamental changes in how the state worked. Corruption, nepotism, and administrative incompetence seemed as present as before, just better hidden. Yet it would be wrong to say nothing changed. The Colectiv tragedy left a deep mark on Romania's collective consciousness, especially for the younger generation. It created a moment of civic awakening and inspired a new generation of activists, investigative journalists, and reformers within the system. Organizations like Deadliest, which built Romania's first pediatric oncology hospital entirely from private donations, grew from frustration with government inefficiency and the desire to show that change is possible. The tragedy also started a national conversation about Romanian society's values and priorities. The Colectiv trauma led to deep reflection about responsibility, solidarity, and moral duty toward others. Journalist Emilia Șercan, who has investigated many corruption cases in Romania, noted, "Colectiv was the moment when we all realized that corruption isn't just about money stolen from the budget. Corruption directly kills. It has real victims with names and faces." 6 years after the tragedy, in May 2021, The Bucharest Court of Appeal issued the final verdict in the Colectiv case, mostly upholding the original sentences. The club owners received 11 years and 8 months each, the pyrotechnicians 10 years each, and Cristian Popescu Piedon 4 years, reduced from 8 years and 6 months. The decision brought some relief to victims' families, though many felt the sentences were too light given what happened. After the verdict, one victim's father reflected, "No punishment will bring my son back. But at least we know there is some kind of justice. What I truly wish is for this tragedy to never be forgotten and for its lessons to be learned by the entire society." 10 years after Colectiv, Romania is different. The physical wounds of survivors have mostly healed, though scars remain. Victims' families have found some peace, though the pain of loss never fully goes away. New generations of young people, who were children when the tragedy happened, have grown up hearing about Colectiv as a warning and a lesson about the human cost of corruption and incompetence. This culture of cutting corners wasn't limited to nightclubs. It was, and often still is, present in many aspects of Romanian public life. In education, where many schools operate without fire safety permits. In healthcare, where old hospitals have dangerous infrastructure. And in public administration, where procedures often exist only on paper. Journalist Catalin Tolontan, whose team exposed the diluted disinfectant scandal, said in a 2020 interview, "Colectiv showed us how fragile we are as a society when we build on lies. It was a moment when the curtain was pulled back, and we all saw the broken systems working in the shadows." For the survivors, life after Colectiv meant constant struggle. Beyond physical recovery, complex surgeries, skin grafts, facial reconstructions, they faced huge psychological challenges: post-traumatic stress, depression, and survivor's guilt. "For months I couldn't enter a room without checking where the exits were," said one survivor. "Loud noises, bright lights, crowds, all these triggered panic attacks. I had to learn to live again in a world that suddenly seemed threatening." For some, the tragedy completely changed their perspective. After going through something like that, your priorities change completely, explained a young woman who suffered burns on 40% of her body. "You realize how fragile life is and how important the truly essential things are: family, friends, health. Everything else, career, money, looks, becomes secondary." Colectiv also brought attention to mental health issues in Romania. Long a taboo subject, depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems were recognized as normal responses to abnormal trauma. Survivors and victims' families spoke openly about their mental health struggles, helping to normalize these discussions. One of the hardest lessons was realizing how fragile social trust is. In a society already marked by high distrust of institutions, Colectiv deepened the feeling that ordinary citizens are abandoned by the state. Early statements by authorities, which tried to minimize institutional responsibility and blame only the club owners, made this worse. After Colectiv, many Romanians realized that in a disaster, they can't count on the state, noted sociologist Barbu Matescu. This created two seemingly opposite reactions: increased civic activism to reform the state, and a tendency to seek individual solutions and avoid relying on public services altogether. In this tension between civic engagement and individual self-reliance lies perhaps the most important legacy of the Colectiv tragedy. It forced Romanians to make a fundamental choice: fight for systematic reforms or accept things as they are and find ways to survive on their own. But Colectiv also left another important legacy: a new kind of national narrative. Until then, major collective tragedies in Romania's history had generally been blamed on external forces: invasions, foreign occupations, or totalitarian regimes imposed from outside. Colectiv was different. It was a tragedy caused by Romanians themselves, a harsh mirror reflecting the dysfunction of their own society. Facing this collective responsibility created a painful but necessary growing up. It forced Romanian society to move beyond stories about historical victimhood and accept that real change starts with taking responsibility. After Colectiv, we can no longer pretend that our problems come only from outside or from the past, observed historian Lucian Boia. It was a moment when Romanians had to face the present and accept that the future depends mainly on their choices now. Despite this potential for transformation, the danger of forgetting is real. Collective memory is fragile, and public attention quickly shifts to new crises and scandals. As years pass, Colectiv risks becoming just a historical reference, its lessons lost in the noise of current events. That's why remembrance and education efforts remain crucial. The memory of the 64 lives lost must be honored not just through yearly mourning, but through concrete actions to prevent similar tragedies. Each permit denied to an unsafe venue, each inspector who does their duty despite pressure, and each citizen who refuses to accept low standards, all honor the memory of the collective victims. For grieving families, time doesn't completely heal the loss, but it can provide new perspectives. Many parents who lost children at Colectiv have found meaning in activism and fighting for justice. "I cannot bring back my daughter," said a mother in 2020, "but I can fight so that her death wasn't meaningless. I want that in 20 years. When someone suffers severe burns in Romania, they'll have real chances of recovery. That would give meaning to her sacrifice." Artist Alexandra Perici, who created an installation dedicated to the Colectiv victims, reflected, "Collective trauma can only be healed through collective action. Remembrance isn't enough if it doesn't come with real structural change." In recent years, this structural change has begun in some areas. The system for approving and inspecting public venues has been reformed, though implementation varies across the country. New burn treatment units have opened, and medical protocols have been updated. Non-governmental organizations have gained a stronger voice in policy decisions. However, huge challenges remain. Corruption, though less visible, continues to weaken public institutions. Doctors and nurses keep leaving the country, further weakening the healthcare system. Many schools, hospitals, and public buildings still operate in facilities that don't meet safety standards. The culture of good enough persists in many areas of public life. Against this backdrop, Colectiv remains a constant warning. It reminds us that the price of negligence and corruption is measured in human lives. It shows that societies that accept compromises on public safety eventually pay an unacceptable price. In the end, the fate of the 64 lives lost at Colectiv is tied to the fate of Romania itself. As poet and Colectiv survivor Laurențiu Istrate wrote, "From our ashes may a country be born, where no one burns for simple dreams."